Hello. It says recording, so I'm going to trust it. In three, two, one. All right. I'm here with my next guest on the One Leg Up Network, Mr. Quang Pham, and his story is very intriguing to me. He's a tech trailblazer and combat veteran, and now he's written a book about Underdog Nation. And when I first got your pitch, I was so enthralled because you're a Marine combat veteran. You've been with the NASDAQ, okay, NASDAQ CEO and refugee turned trailblazer, all that. And here you are having one leg up on life. And I actually brought you on about NASDAQ, so we're going to get into that in a little bit. But tell us your story, Quang. I'm so glad to have you, Quang Pham.
Well, it's a pleasure to be with you, Alex, and your listeners. It's been a one fortunate refugee from Vietnam. Came over here about 50 years ago when I was a kid. Uh, at the last minute, the week before, you see that picture of in the Miss Saigon flight, the helicopter leaving the rooftop. Well, we were gone a week before that. So South Vietnam lost the war. We came to the United States as refugees, started with nothing, no money, no language, no contacts. And so we were instantly an underdog in this nation. I think the second part of the story is that if you're an underdog, there's no better place to come into America, because this is the land of opportunity. And but you gotta produce results. And I think the book that I wrote, Underdog Nation, is about leading with focusing on the effort and producing results. So journey started as a refugee, learned English, worked at age 12, worked my way through college at UCLA out on the other coast, California. Felt I had a duty to serve America, pay back my citizenship. And so got out of college, became a Marine after finishing officer candidate school, and they sent me to flight school. Nobody, nobody thinks about going to war. They just, they want to serve their country. And then war is a reality if you're in the Marine. So next, the Gulf War kicked off. Saddam invaded Kuwait, and a few months later, I landed in Saudi Arabia as a brand new helicopter pilot, flying Marines a few months later out of Kuwait City on a medevac. So spent 7 years on active duty. Went back to the Persian Gulf, through the different deployments. Went to Somalia. Got out, became a pharmaceutical sales representative for a couple of years, and became a dot-com tech entrepreneur. Raised some VC money, and then about 10 years ago, came back to pharmaceutical as a founder CEO. And, in 2023, took a company public called Cadrino Therapeutics, and we focused on developing a blood thinner to fulfill the gaps of where patients, who are not treated well or not reacting well to warfarin, and they can't use Eliquis. So that's the story. He was able to ring the closing bell in February of 2023, one of the highlights of my professional career, and got to do it virtually twice in San Francisco, because the JP Morgan Healthcare Conference there, they have the bell ceremony to open the bell during that week in San Francisco. So that's the 5-minute life story of my. It's an
Wow.
American journey. It's a journey only possible in this country, and I'm living proof. And every day I'm grateful to be in America. And I've just worked hard to do three things, right? To serve my country, which I did, to honor my family, our legacy. We're refugees. We owe this country, and we gave back. And then to contribute this medicine to mankind and womankind across this country and to the world.
You were the first Vietnamese American to fly combat missions for the Marines. Thank you for your service, sir.
Oh,
And
it's a great, a tremendous opportunity and experience.
I believe it. And so, how did that experience in the military shape your entrepreneurial mindset?
Well, number one, I people get scared, of combat, of fighting, of whatever, but you can't let fear cripple you. So that's one thing I learned when I came out of the Marines. I was not fearful of anything. Now I was scared of the uncertainty. How do you translate flying a helicopter off the ship into, selling drugs or writing a business plan or pitching venture capitalists, right? So I was never fearful of failure. I was scared to overcome, that part of being scared. I was very well prepared. So the second part, coming out of the Marines, I was very prepared, just like I was for every mission. We brief every scenario, the backup plan, the backup to the backup. If we can't get fuel, if we run out of ammunition, if the Marines weren't in the zone, what do we do? What if we can't find the ship at night? Or we brief every possible scenario, so we're very much prepared. So no fear, always prepared, and always look to produce results. It's okay to say I flew 15 hours or 80 hours in 1 month, but what did that result in? And so I always brought that to the business world. You went out and made 8 calls a day, 40 calls a week of meeting doctors. What did that produce? What is the result? I took that mentality into the entrepreneurial world. Like, what is the effort and result? I call it going to the ER.
Well, that's very interesting, and then you got into the pharmaceuticals. But I want to talk about the Nasdaq because I literally saw this email the same week I saw Tristan Thompson, who's an NBA guy, be
Yeah.
featured in Nasdaq. I'm like, all right, this is a sign I got to talk Nasdaq. So talk about your experience
Yeah.
on the
So I
floor.
think, yeah. Yeah. So, NASDAQ is one of the two major stock exchanges, obviously, in the United States of the world, right? NASDAQ, New York Stock Exchange. The NASDAQ is where over 90% of the biotech companies like ours, drug development company, pre-revenue, are listed. So, every day there's an opening ceremony and a closing ceremony, right? When there's trading. And so when we went public in January of 2023, I think a month later in February, we were offered an opportunity to close the market, close to ring the closing bell. And so we brought everybody, investors, board members, management team, their family to New York, Times Square. Went into Nasdaq. They treated with royalty. We're one of the listed companies, and I was able to hit the closing bell right at 4 o'clock on the trading day. So that was my first experience. I did 2 openings out in California during the JP Morgan Healthcare Conference, and Nasdaq was so good to me when the Underdog Nation, my book came out, second book came out in April. They brought me, I was up there for a meeting, so they brought me, they asked me for a book cover. They put it on the marquee, and it says, Nasdaq congratulates member CEO Quang Pham on his book publishing. So
In Times Square, how cool is that?
very,
In
very,
Times
very
Square.
cool. Right in Times Square. There it is, my cover of my
Well,
book,
how
my
about this?
name, and
Beyond
yeah. It's all
I
marketing.
always see the pride. Beyond cool, I see the pride because I work right by New York Stock Exchange. I see the pride of every organization that takes their photo there on launch day. I mean, to launch an IPO is probably one of the most accomplishing feelings, isn't it? It's not just what we see on TV; it's a real feeling too.
No, no, it's a real feeling. And for us, the IPO is part of the journey, but it's not the destination, right? For us, the destination is getting the drug approved. When you go public for a biotech company, you're raising money to advance the drug into clinical trials in people. So it's a milestone, right? You get the money from the public offering. The public investors are, you know, they trust you. They trust you that you're going to take their money, put it in clinical trials, advance the drug, and put it in front of the FDA, and get a positive approval, so the drug's out available for we in this country, in our industry. We invent, we advance drugs. The majority of the new drugs in the world come from the United States. So it's an industry that produces goods for the world right here. There's a lot of controversy about drug pricing and
I
a
was
lot
just
of
going
things
to
going
ask
on
you about that because
politics. Yeah.
obviously, when you talk to someone who's manufacturing and producing these, the pricing is an issue. So how do you make sure you have one leg up on your competition to make it more affordable uh,
Yeah.
for customers and patients?
Yeah, I think you have to look at the pricing issue, and I think the Congress, the president, lobbying groups, patient group, you got to look. You can't just look at the list price. You got to look at the net price. Okay, and so there's a list price, and there's a bunch of rebates, and the middle people, the middle companies, the distribution company take their piece, and the PBM take their piece, and so by the time it gets to the patient, there's a copay usually if you have insurance. And then so you have to look at, what is the true price. You can't just look at the list price of a drug. Given that, it takes, this drug that we've worked on, uh, there's been over 200 million invested in it, over the life of the molecule from inception. So this is not a small amount. And that's only a fraction. The pharmaceutical lobbying organization for the industry estimates it's over 1.7 billion of investment before a drug can be approved and used in the United States and the rest of the world. So 250 million were a lot less so far than the average drug that the lobbying organization has put out as the cost of developing drugs in this country.
Well, when you talk about approval, does that mean you're waiting for FDA approval, or has that already happened?
No, we have one more trial. So, with the drug development process, you take a molecule, you put the intellectual property protection around it, you take it into animals, so that's called the preclinical. Then you go to the FDA and say the drug is safe in animal. Can we do it in humans? So that's phase one. Dosing, safety. Then you go to phase two, where you look at efficacy and safety. And then phase three, you're trying to prove that the drug works better than doing nothing or works better than what's the standard of care. So we're at that phase three for our drug tecarfarin. So once we complete that, then we gather all the data, make sure all the third party validates it, then we send it to the FDA, and the FDA makes a determination. Yes, it is approved, or no, it is not approved, but we need this data to look at it again. And so it's a very complicated process, but it's understandably, right, because drugs for people are supposed to save lives, so it's got to be safe. Supposed to cure diseases, so it's got to be safe first. So that's the number one concern for the FDA is safety, then efficacy. They got to make sure it doesn't hurt anybody and that it works. Then you can go to the market with your pricing and stuff. So for us, it's still pricing is it's a way off. We have to complete the last trial.
Well, I'm sure when it is approved, you want to come back on and break that news. I'd love to have you on about that. But I might have missed something when I was transitioning from one of your piece to the other. Were you also medical in the military? Were you on the ground helping, patch up people, or in that sense, or not really?
No, I was a pilot. I was a helicopter
So
pilot
you were just
flying.
doing
Yeah,
piloting. Okay.
yeah. But the difference is I was a assault support pilot. So I take troops into the zone and pick them up, or we, the air crew, right? We're a crew. We're not a single pilot. Two pilots, couple crewmen in the back, and then a corpsman, which is a medic. So in a way, I am involved because part of the mission I flew was the medevac, medical evacuation of wounded Marines and wounded Iraqi soldiers in the Gulf War, and the medic in the back took care of them. And that's the kind of military we are, right? Once the fighting is stopped, we abide by the Geneva Conventions. We just don't leave the enemy on the battlefield. We take care of our own, but if the enemy has surrendered and is hurt, I saw it firsthand. We did it. We flew injured Iraqi soldiers, the enemy, into our aid station, into our hospital, because that's the kind of military that we operate, and people don't forget that. We abide by the Geneva Convention. So, but that's how I was involved medically. We were prepared to fly wounded out, as well as take troops into combat.
Speaking of not forgetting, I've seen highlights. I was only a year old in '93 when the Gulf War, but I've seen highlights of the United Center being so emotional over the national anthem at the time. Why has support? I don't know if it's for the troops so much or just what it is. It's decreased since then. I feel like there's not as much,
Yeah,
every
yeah.
day like there was at times.
Right. Yeah, that's a great point. So okay, I'm a little bit older than you, but I was still a kid during the Vietnam War. So in growing up in America, I saw how America reflected on the Vietnam War was mostly through Hollywood movies, which is part of the culture, right? Pop culture, right? There's certain angles of the war, but because there was a draft going on, it was very controversial, and it was the me generation, and it was the other racial issues in America. So the Vietnam War was very controversial. So when it ended, uh, during towards the end, they blamed the troops. They blamed everybody, but the troops didn't get the military service member didn't get the recognition like the World War II. So that's 1975, late 70s, and you go to 1990. Now you have President Bush. The Republicans are in office. We haven't entered a war since Vietnam. There was a lot of hesitation. And then we go to the Gulf War. It was over. It was clear who the enemy was. We did the right thing. The world supported us. Congress didn't pass. Congress didn't take a vote, but it passed a resolution to let President Bush send us there. And when the mission was over, we came home. We didn't occupy Kuwait or Iraq or anything. So support was overwhelming. I think now, 20 years of war in Afghanistan and Iraq, there's kind of a fatigue, right? There's no military draft, but it's like, okay, people
Well, and
want peace.
there is
Yeah,
a fear that we could go back into these wars we're in now. We're seeing now. There is a real
yes.
fear that our troops could be included. Now, what are your thoughts then, if you don't mind me asking, while we're on this topic, of the I don't know if they're American expats or whatever, but they did go over to Ukraine and fight under the
Oh yeah.
Ukrainian army. That was very interesting.
No. They were not expats. They were American citizens. A lot of them were retired military or former military who went over there in a capacity, as a private citizen, not under the colors of the U.S. military at all. So, but then that's their right, whether they're going over the contractor or not. As far as involvement, I think we all saw the withdrawal from Kabul, a number of years ago. It looked a lot like the withdrawal from Saigon when I was a kid. I think in general, intervention. I think the American people know that intervention never take 1 or 2 years, right? Once we intervene somewhere, we're there for a long time, and it takes a long time to leave
And it literally took
a
us
conflict.
21 years to try
Yes.
and leave Afghanistan. And yet, I mean, you're watching this as a former military. You got to think what a disaster it was.
It's a repeat. Is the country better off? Are we better off today before we went into that war? Are the Afghans better off? And then you look at all the injuries and the death, right? Over, God, thousands of death, but a lot of injuries because the armor is so good that the soldiers on the battlefield are surviving, right? They lose all their limbs, but all their vital organs are protected because of the armor plating.
All right, to have one leg up as an entrepreneur. See, I just love saying this phrase. It just fits you. And as as a refugee and whatnot, did you have to hide? I don't know how to say it, but bury the PTSD? Did you have any leaving? I mean, how do you cope with that while launching this business?
Great question. So, when I went into the Marines, it was, in the mid 80s when all these Vietnam War movies, and a lot of them were anti-war Vietnam movies, right? We shouldn't have been there. The veterans are the victims. All Vietnamese people are the enemy, whether they're from the north or south or whatever. There's no distinction. So I go to the Marines, and they were talking to me as I was the enemy trying to infiltrate. They were part of the screening head games. I didn't have time to deal with PTSD. I just fought through it because I knew that I had the right stuff to belong and that the opportunities will be there and enough good people will see that. It was a mental block for me because my father was in prison at the same time. He lost the war as a South Vietnamese and he was in prison. So for me to go in the US Marines and fail, they would say, well, the South Vietnamese didn't fight and their son couldn't make it on the Marine Corps. I would not allow that to happen. So I didn't
So
have
it's
time to
almost
deal
like
with
you were
PTSD.
protecting your heritage and your legacy by
Yes.
doing this and succeeding in it.
Yes, yes. Uh, at that time, I had to prove that, hey, that's not the way the war. The war turned out the way that we lost, but it wasn't without effort like my father's generation, and it all turned out to be true. Um, I knew once I got through that, I would have a successful stint, and everything happened the way it was. And then when I left the military, I had a lot of confidence. I was a good presenter, speaker. I had really no fear besides, things that I talked about before. You get scared, but you overcome the fear, and I was always prepared. So I took a lot of good things, and not everybody had the experience I did. And I try to share that. You have to fight through it. There's no, they don't give it to you in a silver platter. The Marine Corps does not promise you a rose garden. That's one of the recruiting pitches.
Uh, you know, Vietnamese and Vietnam obviously still strikes a nerve whenever you talk about just saying country's name, Vietnam. So going in as one of the first, was there a stigma you had to overcome, if you will, being Vietnamese, or were they very accepting?
Oh yeah, of course it was. I mean, we were in Vietnam for 20 years. The United States was. The war didn't turn out the way that we thought it was. They thought it was going to come in and it would be over back in the 60s in 6 months. It turned out we lost over 60,000, right? The names are on the wall, about 300,000 wounded in action. The Vietnamese people lost about 3 million. It was a long and bloody war. So what happened when I came in the mid 80s was that all those Vietnam War movies, Platoon, Full Metal Jacket, this was part of the culture. Like I said, the Vietnamese people in those movies were always depicted as the enemy. There was no ally or friends. And now there I was in a U.S. military uniform trying to make it. And there were people who were Vietnam vets that were still on active duty. And, one of them said, hey, man, we used to kill people like you, the enemy. But I let that go by because I knew as part of the screening process. Okay, I figured it out after a few weeks that I landed in Quantico, where Officer Candidate School was, and I was going to be over the sergeant and the gunnery sergeant that were screening me. So I had to prove to them that I had the physical, but also the mental. I had to do what it took to become a Marine officer, and no doubt the first month there was rough. All the PTSD, didn't have to try to deal with it, but it was there, and all of the cultural stigma that I had to deal with, and all of the profanity, all of the name calling. But that was part of the game back then. It was a
And
screening period.
if I hear you correctly, you were a kid in Vietnam during the war.
Yeah,
Is that correct?
yeah,
So wow,
yeah.
this is sort of like your own healing journey as well to join the military. That
I fought in my country. Yeah,
exactly, it's like a healing journey, also in a sense.
yeah. So there was one moment that after I completed it, I didn't think I was going to go in to serve. I figured, hey, I proved to these guys I had what it took. I graduated, but I went to the Vietnam Wall in Washington D.C. and I realized there were 60,000 names, 58,000, 60,000 names on there, and I didn't know one name. I didn't know one name of a person who died, who fought for my country, who fought for the freedom of South Vietnam. Right? Some veterans will say, "I didn't fight for Vietnam. I went and fought for America." But in a way, they fought for South Vietnam, okay, against the communists. So the whole vision was if you stop communism in Southeast Asia, it would not come to Hawaii and California and to America. You fight it over
Right.
there. It's also called the domino theory. So for all of that, I felt I owed this country at least a few years in uniform.
Amazing. I got to ask about MASH because obviously that was big around that time you joined.
Yeah,
So, and of course they were big in the medical world. Like all we saw were all these guys getting repaired and all that. But did
yeah.
MASH have an impact on you?
No, because MASH was in the 70s when the war was still going on. Okay. MASH was a unit, I believe, because MASH was in the 70s. So when I came to the United States, the MASH was already off TV. Like I said, the big movies that came out, and there were two that were very opposite in the summer of 1986, a few years before you were born. One was Platoon, right? Oliver Stone's Platoon, a very dramatic of the grunt, the infantry. And the other movie that came out that summer was Top Gun. How to become this pilot, this fancy
Sure.
aviator in the Navy. So I was going through Marine training on like basic, infantry shooting officer cadet school, but I was going to become a Marine pilot. So I counted from both sides.
Very, very intriguing. And now look at you. You're thriving. You're a CEO, right? And it's amazing. And as a leader now, do you look at your team as if you're in the battlefield of science, that you want to conquer this issue of blood thinners? It seems like it's a passion of yours right now.
It's a passion, and it's always how can you rally people around resources to complete a mission, right? And our mission is complete when we get the drug approved. And the approval rate, one, is very low. Number two, is very hard to raise capital in this market to continue. So you have to be innovative. You got to be passionate. You got to have scientific proof. And so pulling all of that together and constantly looking at our effort and our results. If we're doing something that's not producing the result, then we got to change our effort, right? It's the old saying about the insanity, right? The definition is doing the same thing and expecting a different result. That's called insanity. So we try to not do the same thing, and if we don't get the result, we're going to change it up. You don't go and pitch the same pitchers if you lose a 3-game series, right? You got to change it up. You got to bring in a middle reliever. You
Sure.
Yankees know about that. You got to change the lineup. If somebody's not hitting in the fourth spot, you got to get somebody in there. Somebody who's leading off is not getting on base. You got to switch up the lineup. So we're constantly reviewing our effort to make sure
And
we get
and
the result.
and you mentioned a couple of brands. Do you look at those brands and say, man, they're doing a disservice to those who need it? That's why we can step into this space even more.
Oh yeah, we work in the anticoagulant or blood thinning space, right, to prevent stroke. Okay, so stroke is one of the top 3 causes of death in America and the world. Heart disease is number 1, and then cancer is right up there too. So we believe what we're doing is very important to prevent death. And so when drugs that are expensive that are out there that are not meeting certain pockets, we call them gaps. That's what our drug is designed to do, is to take care of the areas and conditions where the big drugs aren't meeting.
Yep. DC to talk about our or just do any lobbying of that kind?
You were cut off a little bit. I'm sorry about the
Do you get
lobbying.
to DC to talk about your drug or not really?
Oh yeah, I get asked to go on certain news, to talk about it. You just have to, when you talk to the general public, you got to make sure you use, language that people can really understand, right? Blood clots causes strokes and heart attack. We're developing a blood thinner to minimize the risk of getting blood clots, which causes strokes and death. So that's the common language. When you talk about scientific, then we're developing an anticoagulant to prevent thrombus formation, which can lead to a stroke or a MI, myocardial infarction, or a heart attack. So when we talk like this in general, I try to make sure I use language that people can understand. It's just like military language and acronyms are hard to understand in the public, but people use them in military time. You just got to know who the audience is and kind of cater our talk towards that audience. So there's a common understanding in the conversation.
Where can people find your studies? I'm sure you guys have done the study on this drug
Oh yeah,
over and
so
over.
the drug's called ticarfrin. So sounds like warfarin because it's in the same class. The company's called Cadrenal Therapeutics, and if readers want to look me up, I'm on LinkedIn, or you can Google me, or go to my speaker author website, quangxpham.com, QUANGXPHAM.com.
All right, I gotta ask you this because this Vietnam connection is fascinating to
Sure.
me. Do you, and you don't have to answer, do you, it's hard to forgive LBJ, but do you forgive him at all? I don't know. In my heart, I don't know if I can ever forgive, but what's your thought about him? Because obviously he was the catalyst to all of this.
Yeah, there were a couple of things that happened real quick. So before President Lyndon B. Johnson, I always paid respect to the president in the office. President Johnson came to office because President Kennedy was assassinated. But what people didn't know that in 1963, President Kennedy was assassinated in November of 1963 in Texas. Well, 3 weeks before that, a coup happened in South Vietnam where the president of South Vietnam, who was a Catholic, and it was, the Kennedy administration totally supported him, President Diem, he was assassinated, coordinated. Okay. So in a matter of a month, the president of South Vietnam was assassinated, President Kennedy was assassinated. And so the whole involvement, when LBJ took office in 1964, there was just 16,000 Americans there on an advisory. It got escalated. Next, the Marines landed in 1965. Next, 500,000 Americans were in Vietnam by 1968. And so it was gradual escalation. But the change in the regime definitely had a big effect on the Vietnam War. First, we were there to help them with advisors. Then we said, no, we got to send in our own combat troops. Then we had to build up the South Vietnamese to look like the U.S. military to take over the war. Then we withdrew. So it was a very complex war, but having been an author and living through it with my family, my first book, A Sense of Duty, I found great relief in that I found the answers through my own research and my own interviews rather than relying on textbooks and Hollywood movies.
You soldier, you've interviewed people along the way here then.
Oh yeah, well, so I had interviews that were in the public domain, but I went and interviewed South Vietnamese officials about, you fought in the war. The United States gave the South Vietnamese all of these resources for 2 decades. What happened? So I wanted to hear firsthand. And when my father came out of prison, I was able to get some interviews that he did with an American journalist before he died. So I put all that pieces together to write A Sense of Duty, which was published by Random House 20 years ago. So there were 20 years between my first book, A Sense of Duty, Our Journey from Vietnam by Random House in 2005, and my second book, my fourth book, Underdog Nation, that came out in April of 2025.
All right, there are so many people who have fled war torn. I mean, there's no doubt about it, and are working in society to contribute and have gone through the legalization process as well. So how can we change the view on immigration in the sense of, yes, we want people to come here and contribute? I feel like that sentiment is kind of going away by the bad apples.
Yeah. So I think, I know the Vietnam War, obviously, because of our heritage and our circumstances. Um, the Vietnamese refugee really had a big friend in the late President Ford. He went through Congress right after the war ended, to Saigon fell. The picture of the helicopter coming atop, the building with a bunch of people on the ladder. With all that process got passed really quick in the spring of 1975. So, fast forward, 2 billion Vietnamese are in the United States. Okay, I mean, it's a lot of sympathy, a lot of overdue, because there was a relationship between the two countries, right? American GIs had Vietnamese wives, you know, kids that were American, had American father, Vietnamese mother, and there were Americans that went over there for 2 or 3 combat tours in State Department. So there was this deep relationship that South Vietnam, had a lot of Americans wanted to help the South Vietnamese. So when you go to the Gulf War, when we went to the Gulf War, we weren't allowed to go into the city and have R and hang out with the locals. It was very segregated. We were on forward operating base, and then I think the Iraq and the Afghanistan experience was the same thing. There was no intermingling with the locals, right? So there was not a deep connection. So when you have that, and when you don't have a military draft, the general public is kind of disengaged from it. They don't really know the Afghan refugee or the Iraqis, like the South Vietnamese, and so you can't compare the conflicts. I think the economy is so diverse. It just there's just people pursuing their life that if they don't have a family member and they didn't serve, they're removed from those situations, and even more removed from the people from those countries where we sent troops for the last 21 years. And so then now you put the overseas conflict, military conflict, and you compare that to the border situation, and that's you know that's over a century of history of Mexico California border, and so they don't really compare. And I'm a California native. I lived out there most of my life before moving to Florida. You know, just 2 hours north of Tijuana, the border. I've been down in Mexico. The Mexican people are part of California in the culture, as well as the productivity of certain sector, including the agriculture sector, the housing sector, the real estate sector. It's a hard topic, and I think every administration is dealing with it differently.
Absolutely. All right. Do you feel like in your position and your journey, you've almost in your own way repaired relationship between Vietnamese and Americans? You're the connector, it feels like. So did you feel like going back to Vietnam and sort of saying the good things America was doing 20 years later when you joined the military?
Yeah, that time has passed. I went back to Vietnam in 1995, 30 years ago, when the country was about to no, when our two countries were about to normalize. I'm an American. My life is here, my family's here, my job, my friends, my connection. Um, Most of the Vietnamese people, right? 2/3 of the population was born after the war, so they don't really have memories, and they don't have PTSD. They don't have, and they don't call it the Vietnam War. They call it the American War back there. And I think a lot of people have moved on. One, because they won, and two-thirds of them were born after 1975. It's like our baby boom generation, right? After World War II, the GIs came home. There was no more fighting. They had a lot of kids, and there was a big boom. That's what happened in Vietnam. It's almost too crowded there. When I was there, both North and South had 30 something million people. The population is like 110 million today. And Vietnam is kind of a skinny California. It's not a very big country. There's a lot of rough terrain, high grounds, and the Pacific Ocean to the east of the country, on the other side, Laos and Cambodia, and very mountainous up in the north. So it's overpopulated almost in the cities. But I don't have, it's my birthplace, but America is my home. I don't feel like I have to go back and change or lecture to anybody. I love
Oh,
it
I
here.
love that.
And yeah, this is my country. It's a country that my mom, when we got here, didn't feel like we had to change our names. We have our names that were given to us at birth, and it's okay. This country elected somebody called Barack Obama after 9/11, so anything's possible. So I think people still here judge you by your conduct and your character versus your name or your
Absolutely.
race. So I still believe in that.
All right. Your book, Underdog Nation, what do you hope it accomplishes and inspires for the next generation, if you will?
You know, I'm practical. People's time are scarce, so if somebody picks up the book and gets one thing out of it, and knowing that if you're an underdog, okay, you got to focus on giving the right effort to produce the results. Okay. You can't expect people to hand things to you. Okay. When you go after results, good things will happen. That's it.
That's it, plain and simple. Well, I feel like you have one leg up on in your career, in your life, and you're helping others have one leg up through this conversation today. And I want you back. I like hearing about this. I like that you're. Can I say doing it the right way? Because I feel like there are some drug companies that don't do it exactly the right way. I feel like you're doing it the right way.
No, thank you. I'm in New York a lot. I would like to get together with you for a meal. You've shown me a lot with your life and what you have to do with, have to deal with. So we'll see each other in New York, my friend.
All right, Quang X Pham, thanks so much for joining, and do come back to the One Leg Up Network.
Great. Thank you, Alex. See you again. Bye-bye.
That was perfect. Thank you.
Thank you. Anytime. We'll see you in New York sometime next 6 months.
Yes, sir. Thank you.
Bye-bye.